Hi, I'm Jennifer Hosek. I'm a professor in languages, literatures, and cultures at Queen's University, and I'm recording in November 2024, shortly after the US election. This is an abridged version of my course, Fascism in Europe, which I taught last semester, and I hope that it'll be useful for you for learning and for teaching. It's under Creative Commons copyright, so please give credit where credit is due. This abridged version consists of weeks that I talk about what I talked about in lecture in an abridged version, and then you would ideally add discussion with your students or the people that are watching with you, since obviously thinking of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, famously, we need to engage rather than simply consume knowledge. And I also have managed to enlist the aid of some of my colleagues who are also doing guest lectures in the course. So I hope that you'll enjoy the course and that you'll learn a lot from it. In terms of testing, I decided to have in-class essay tests because I wanted to avoid having the students engage with the hallucinatory stories that are sometimes told by AI around the difficult problem of fascism in particular. Let's see where AI leads us down our path of knowledge. So in thinking about the war, particularly World War II, which sometimes bears the wrong-headed moniker, the Good War, it's easy to get mesmerized. It's easy to be captivated by mythic narratives of heroism, by mythic narratives of selfless collective effort for the common good. Such narratives of collective effort for the common good are so seldom lauded at other times, particularly in the global north. Consider the pandemic, for example, when even wearing a mask was considered by some to be a dangerously anti-individualistic act. So we might think about the idea of the selflessness of the war effort as a mythology being instrumentalized by people who benefit from war. Typically not the people, the average bear, let's say. So when thinking about war, it's easy to get mesmerized by that transcendent internal peace that we as humans tend to feel when we have a kind of a collective thinking of what needs to get done and then do it. And it's easy to be beguiled by a promise of limitless camaraderie and of belonging, things that we might not experience in regular life. The idea of blood brothers to the death, which brings up masculinity and the idea of the mythic time when everything was so simple and men were men and men were strong. You can see how this alluring idea of a better world can be instrumentalized, can be used in order to get us involved in war efforts. When thinking about fascism, it's easy to get allured by the shiny black boots and the broad-shouldered black leather coats of the men, by the mass salutes, the mass choral chants of those who have wanted to be victors by any means necessary. So this course, it aims to examine fascism without reinscribing that aura. You'll find ways to do it in your version of the course. I start the course with its results, and here we see a rendition of Pablo Picasso's Guernica, the destruction formed by fascism, caused by fascism. Here we have an image of a child viewing Guernica in Madrid, as well as bombed out Madrid in 1937. You'll recall that Guernica explicitly references the Spanish Civil War, and so European fascism and war in general. The Spanish Civil War was fought between 1936 and 1939, with the Republicans supporting the common people and the nationalists fighting for and with the monarchists, the conservatives, the traditionalists. The Spanish Civil War is sometimes called a dress rehearsal for World War II. The fascism of World War II fame is not a one-off anomaly. The fascism of World War II fame is part of an upwelling arising from a widespread, fertile, and deeper current. It's up to each of us to resist the alluring aura that violence and violent oppression can project. We must look critically behind Oz's curtain to see the dangerous and laughable wizard. We must attend to any dangerous and laughable wizards in us, what Hannah Arendt may have called, thinking of the little wizards, our own little Eichmanns. Our course schedule image was the Grimm's brothers' famous, enchanting, and toxic red and white polka dotted flyagiric mushroom. Not sure if that pronunciation is right, but the reference to Grimm's brothers, I'm sure, resonates for you. And that brings up the German forest, the beautiful German forest, the Schwarzwald, for example, unfortunately co-opted also by the Nazis for their blood and soil ideology, that little mushroom in the little woods. Of significance in our course is how these blood and soil mythologies were, and indeed are, transported. Mythologies here, I'm calling mythology is a capacious and false narrative that are nevertheless very compelling to us. A common and even quotidian mouthpiece of the powerful is mass media and its spectacle. Who wasn't raised on Hollywood's Disney? The culture industry par excellence, as we'll see. Mass media of that day and mass media of today, it hypnotizes, it excites us. Mass rallies with music, with fire, with fiery speeches that exhaust and excite, perhaps in amphitheaters, they extend for hours into torch-illuminated nights. Electronic mass media, also very powerful, arose in overdeveloped countries at the ends of the 1800s with cinema, the cinema palaces, and in the 1920s and the 30s with radio. Radio was particularly important for the Nazis in addition to the famous mass rallies, and television made inroads as well. So let's define some terms, and then we'll talk about mass media and power. We'll see again the mesmerizing eyes of the Python Ka. And we are, in that case, the young Mowgli, under his benevolent spell, trust me. These working definitions from Mark Neocleus. Far from being a parenthesis in European history, fascism is constitutive of that history, that upwelling versus the current. Far from being some kind of political aberration, fascism is in fact a problem of the normal organization of our lived relations. Some quickly said statement and something to sit with, something to really sit with. Fascism is a form of reactionary modernism. This is Neocleus again, responding to the alienation and exploitation of modern society, but unwilling to lay down any serious challenge to the structure of private property that's central to modern capitalism. Fascism can only set its compass by the light of reaction, a mythic past to be recaptured within the radically altered conditions of modernity that feels so frightening. This politics of reaction to we just want a time back in the day when everything was right, everything was good, everything was controllable, everything was healthy. This kind of reaction, it constitutes the ideological basis of a revolution from the right, in which war, nature, and the nation become the central terms. So I've also chosen totalitarianism, and totalitarianism is an interesting term that was coined in the 50s, MacArthur's Red Scare, and then was used in the 60s to make a comparison between Hitler and Stalin, and in this way draw people with leftist leanings away from what the goings on in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and to encourage them to be very adherent to the system of the capitalist West. So that was simply it was simply wrong-headed, and in addition, and so that term is not that useful. In addition, it's important to recognize that the idea of authoritarianism imagines that we can't resist, that there are no points of weakness in the structure. Far more useful is a term such as authoritarianism. And here I simply am using Wikipedia. I think that it's important to recognize the difference between an AI-generated definition and a Wikipedia definition that's created by humans who are struggling together to come up with definitions that we can all agree on or that we contest. And I think that this is a good one: a political system involving the use of strong central power to preserve the status quo, and reduction in the rules of law, separation of powers, and democratic voting. So Hitler's authoritarian system, for example. And let's talk about populism, which has been getting a bad name today, perhaps very much understandably. Most basic, it appeals to the people. And then there's a debate about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, let's say, and those believing that the masses cannot recognize their own best interests and may be misled by charismatic leaders tend to see populism as negative. And these challenges are certainly real. And I'd like us to remember that there's also the idea that people are best equipped to take care of their own needs, especially when they are educated in all kinds of ways. And that's why I really like Laclau's and Mouffe's ideas about populism that is necessary for people's welfare. Those believing that that those engaged in socio-political decisions we need populism in order for the good of the people to be served. And democracy, a very popular concept that we die for, that we work for. Government system in which the power is vested in the citizenry, and the government works for the citizens for that reason. And I submit that it is questionable whether any nation has achieved full democracy. So we can see it, and we can see it as an aspirational goal. What is nationalism? It imagines the nation and the state as one, and it ends up becoming exclusionary, in which one nation is better than another nation. The us is better than the them. And there's a very slippery slope between nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism typically getting a good name. You might want to think about the politics of us and them. And Jason Stanley is an important book in this class, was a basic book for my class. Jason Stanley's the How Fascism Works, the politics of us and them. And here's a concept before we get started on the mass media: the idea of the Holocaust as comparable. Historically in West Germany, and I come from German studies and comparative literature, West German education sought to highlight the uniqueness of the Holocaust and of Nazism. In East Germany, the same was done. And the aim there was to be sure that Germans would not, in the future, again, be responsible for such an atrocity, be guilty of such an atrocity. It aimed to encourage Germans to take responsibility and not to relativize the crimes. It aims to diminish interest in pro-Nazi tendencies and maintain vigilance in the populace. And increasingly, scholars who work on the Holocaust have been talking about the benefits of of comparison, because certainly there are similarities between systemic oppressions and genocide through time and place. Considering the Holocaust to be unique can be a political blinder, and it can be a straitjacket. Here in this class, we're looking, for example, at German colonialism as a precursor to German fascism. Currently, many actions by nationalist states and national leaders are being called fascist. Such comparisons promise to alert all of us to oppressions elsewhere. For instance, if we see relationships between Nazi fascism and other organized violence, then we here, for example, in Canada, won't imagine that fascism was all Hitler's fault, or maybe just all the fault of the Germans, but that we have we're not at all connected to any genocides or oppressions throughout the world. Again, in our world, the way we answer the question about the uniqueness of the Holocaust has great political significance. For instance, it helps define the victims and the perpetrators. It helps define who should be stopped. It helps define who should be honored, and perhaps whom should be granted reparations. Let's go on to talking about the mass media. I wrote industrial strength spectacle because in this time there's really the rise of ways to reach the masses that weren't around before. Mass spectacle is very famously known in the German situation, and there we see August Landmesser, who doesn't have his hand raised at a mass rally. Isabel Wilkerson in Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents, also talks about Landmesser and his story. So instead of showing you the mass rallies, I'm showing you the resistance. Hopefully we can think about the importance of those rallies without getting sucked into that mesmerizing aura, as Landmesser didn't. Mass media, as mentioned previously, very important is cinema. People will know Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, as well as earlier films such as Metropolis, perhaps proto-fascist, certainly talking about the connections or the tensions, let's say, between the right and the left in Germany. And in the case of radio, here I took an image of the tower that's reminiscent of the Tour Eiffel this is in Charlottenburg in West Germany. You might be more familiar with the Alex Tower from East Germany. That's really the symbol of the city nowadays. This radio, it's extremely affordable and extremely popular. Radio Volksempfänger, so the folk, the people. It was introduced in 1933. The year that Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany and the Gleichschaltung, the coordination of Germany, began. Radios were one of many budget products subsidized by the Third Reich. For example, the Volkskühlschrank, the people's refrigerator, and the Volkswagen, that you'll know, the people's car, kept people happy with their consumer goods. Here I have a quote from Bergerson, and I'll quote you a longer one. Radios emphasized consumer-oriented programming as a means to build consensus among the German people and to distract them from the sacrifices and destruction being conducted in their name. The Nazis took control of radio organizations and programming in the 30s, an expression of the Gleichschaltung. In the same stroke, industrialists profited from the high volume of sales. Low-income consumers were given access to the news media, and the Nazi regime was given more direct access to the folk in their very own living rooms. Censorship. The famous Entartete Kunst degenerate art exhibit was started in Munich, which is also the seat of fascism with the beer hall putsch. 1937. The confiscated works represented modernist styles that are very famous today, such as Expressionism, Dadaism, Surrealism, New Objectivity, and they were done by people that the Nazis didn't like. Jews, Germans, Jewish Germans, communists, women. And they talked about things like poverty. They talked about class division. They talked about alienation, things that the Nazis didn't want to have people be talking about, while they were trying to create a sense of nation as a heroic nation of people who were all the same, really, and all healthy and all thinking in a certain direction. Interestingly or famously, this exhibit had over 2 million visitors, making it one of the most visited exhibitions of modern art in like known Western history. I'll show you one of my favorite exhibits called Empty Library here in Bebelplatz, which is in front of the Humboldt University and also in front of the Law Library in Berlin. And you can see that here under the ground, we see the empty bookshelves. Censorship is not a thing of the past. Here we see that I've highlighted CAST and the 1619 Project as two examples of critical Black studies that have been being censored recently, and Fahrenheit 451 is a famous example of the burning of books, which connects us back to Bebelplatz. And seemingly, for example, in the United States, people are afraid of rainbows. We had the banning recently of Rainbow Land in Wisconsin when an elementary school class wanted to sing it in a school event. Seemingly, rainbows are very frightening to some people, and it's important. While that may seem silly, or maybe I'm making a joke of it, perhaps I shouldn't be making a joke of it, because we see the slippery slope from rainbows to books to any kind of political dissent. Let's talk more about Ka and Mowgli, the culture industry. And we have the very well-known Frankfurt School group that includes Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, and their very famous book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. There are many examples of books that I could have chosen and selections that I could have chosen, and I simply chose a couple of bits from Enlightenment as Mass Deception. I encourage you to expand on any of these pieces of my short lecture in your version of your learning environment around fascism and anti-fascism. The whole world is made to pass through the filter of the culture industry. Real life is becoming indistinguishable from the movies. No scope is left for the imagination, just consumption. All the other films and products of the entertainment industry, which viewers have seen, have taught them what to expect. They react automatically, thinking of our phones. The might of industrial society is lodged in men's minds through this cultural experience. The entertainment manufacturers know that their products will be consumed. The culture industry as a whole has molded men as a type, unfailingly reproduced in every product. The call for critical thinking, opposing the culture industry. These ideas that are made famous in the Frankfurt School have been brought forward by other thinkers, such as Noam Chomsky, very accessible work, and he's a very copious writer. Prodigious writer, I believe, is the term. Manufacturing Consent, I highly recommend. We're back to Ka, and here I'll give you one excerpt, the mass media serve as a symbol for communicating messages and symbols to the general system. The mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It is their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda. And here I'm reminded of Laclau's point about populism. Perhaps we needn't be so concerned about the mass media, or we wouldn't need to be so concerned about the mass media were we in a more equitable society. But as Chomsky's pointing out, the needs of the general populace are not served in the society where we live. And so the danger of consuming the culture industry is, without any kind of critique, is the way that it allows us to simply fit in to the hegemony that's not benefiting us. There are lots of people, too, that follow up on Chomsky, and one that occurred to me when writing is the social dilemma, also very, very easy to engage with. And despite the strength of the culture industry, resistance from within is possible. Hopefully resistance from without as well, if we can be outside. And one of my favorite examples is The Great Dictator, and I just urge you to take a look at the final speech. As we've learned in Nazi Germany and today, people are mesmerized by messaging presented in rallies, news outlets, and exciting, shiny new technologies such as radio, TV, and cinema, and now social media, and its rabbit holes and hallucinatory echo chambers. The Frankfurt School's analysis notwithstanding, cultural production, even Hollywood production, can resist hegemonic power. And Chaplin's Great Dictator is a great example. Although Chaplin really struggled very hard to make it, and Hollywood also supported the US war agenda, and nevertheless, films like The Great Dictator and cultural production like The Great Dictator stands as an example of the power of the resistance of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And I encourage you again to see the final speech. That's what I have for you today. Up next week, in week 2, the former instructor of fascism in Europe, Professor David Pugh, will be speaking on the origins of European fascism. Join me again for week 3, fomenting fascism in Germany and elsewhere. Thank you.